dive in here. Did Doug say he was coming right back then?
I'm on audio with you.
Okay, great. I've got Douglas, Bill, Brian, Brett, Tanya, Evan, Amy, Luke, Dan. Okay, looks like we've got everybody here. Let's get started. Welcome everyone to our second subgroup meeting of Legislation and Authority subgroup. An email did go out yesterday with an agenda. Aaron, if you wouldn't mind pulling that up real quick, we'll just quickly walk through that and lay out the structure for the conversation today. Easier said than done. There it is.
Sorry
Okay.
about that. Got it? Okay.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. Looks like everyone can see it. So just a couple minutes here on the welcome. Again, most of the time is dedicated to a working session here to go over a couple of those recommendations that we kind of left on the table for additional work. Thanks to Bill and Brian and Douglas for their time spent in getting us that document. We also wanted to provide space today, talk about any additional recommendations you've been thinking about that we haven't up until this point. And then we'll also talk a few action items and next steps, including one of those for the November 30th full task force meeting. It's going to be a report out by the subgroup. So we would like volunteers, otherwise it'll be conscriptions, to lead a report out of our conversations here from the subgroup. So with that, any questions or comments on the agenda? Okay, great. I think that kind of covers the first item there, the welcome and the purpose. The spreadsheet, which Aaron will be pulling up, will look familiar to you. This is the working document that's been evolving as these discussions have occurred. Actually, let me just pause for a minute. Are there any initial comments? Fortunate to have our DEQ staff, or I'm sorry, Eagle staff with us today. Amy, Luke, are there any comments for the group that you wanted to make before we get started?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Thanks, Mark.
Sure. And one of the things I might just add, obviously we've been struggling with is the next step, and that is this subgroup's work and how do these recommendations look getting it to the task force level. And so we don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good or the possible. And so I think we'll work through these and get them in relatively good shape today, especially the work that Bill and others have done regarding specific language addressing licensing and financial responsibility. And so with that, I guess I might turn it over to those gentlemen who spent the time and kind of maybe give us sort of take it from the top here. I mean, the first one we've adopted or it's pending. I don't think we need to spend any time there. And really the work you've done kind of covers both recommendations 2 and 4 there on the Excel sheet. So let me stop there and ask if one of you would be willing to just sort of share with us the process you went through, conversation you had, and then we'll open it up for some questions, comments, clarifications from the other subgroup members.
Just to correct you, Douglas and Brian did the bulk of the work on this, just so everybody understands it. But I'm fully supportive. They did great work. And
okay.
I don't know who wants to, Brian or Douglas, you want to kind of walk through? Do we have that on
yes.
Yeah.
I'll just sort of echo what Bill is saying, but differently in saying that Doug did the bulk of the work, and it is greatly appreciated.
What they mean is that I took the pen first, but
yes.
They both contributed in conversation, and Brian did a heavy edit, so can't escape blame entirely, Brian.
What I tried to convey.
Excellent.
what I tried to convey in the email transmittal is that, again, sort of one of the challenges here is, specific language at this level of detail. And while clearly it addresses a recommendation, this seems like a working document that will support the recommendation from the full task force. If you follow me, this will be the starting point for future groups that pick up the recommendations that come out of the task force and continue down the road of making those changes when they happen. If you follow what I'm saying.
Yep.
I think that makes sense, and we recognize that this was seemingly fairly detailed, but there are a number of key points in here that we thought would help us through to the end. We may as well be explicit about hard things, right? So that's where what the motive is. So the key ideas as outlined here are, that we want a licensing approach so that there's sort of continuing oversight that has teeth, and then we want financial responsibility that isn't just a declaration of financial responsibility, but ensures that funds are available to meet that responsibility or forces a change in responsibility. So that's the general theory of this. So kind of starting from the top, we deal with licensing new dams. We don't think there will be a lot, but it's sort of a matter of completeness. We didn't talk about it, but I don't think it's yet clear cut that Edenville won't have to be considered a new dam, going forward. So we'll just leave that to the side. And then we go to licensing existing dams. And in both cases, we're trying to set up that the scope of application is dams on navigable streams or tributaries thereto. What that leaves out is basically land-based dams, which could potentially be hazardous. I'd leave it to Eagle staff to say if they're aware of any that we should worry about, that would be either of the two, high-risk categories. So we can know whether to worry about that point. But extension to tributaries there too is a little bit of an extension beyond the core requirement in the Constitution that counties approve dams on navigable streams. But given our definition of navigation, it probably doesn't encompass a lot of additional dams. So, and then on new dams, we're saying a term of 50 years or less if the licensee wants less, or if the director, meaning Director of Eagle, determines that the expected life is less. On the existing dams, the idea there is that the terms for an initial license should be quite a lot shorter, because these are mostly old dams that have got, whatever wear and tear from age, and also have had an opportunity to amortize whatever benefits their owners originally anticipated. This draft puts the term at 15 years or less. I consider that to be somewhat negotiable, but we should calibrate it so that it really takes in the need to relook at any of these reasonably soon. We carve out those licensed by FERC to some extent in two ways. One is to say that the term of any state license for a FERC licensed dam would be coincident with the term of the FERC license. And then the other is when we get down to the license issuance criteria, we're going to sort of acknowledge that FERC has a lot to say about that. And while still asserting that there's some things the state should address. So we'll get to that in a minute. But that's the reason for having a separate discussion of the licensing of FERC licensed dams. So before I go further, any comments from Bill or Brian about that piece of it, or questions or comments from others?
The fundamental change that we're recommending here is that rather than getting a one-time permit, this is what we're recommending. Rather than getting a one-time permit, you got to renew it, just like you do under every other environmental statute when you're dealing with water.
Okay, I'd pause for just a minute. Maybe Luke, I don't know if you, there hasn't been a lot of time, I know, to sort of digest this language, but any initial thoughts from you or Amy on what you're seeing here?
Just one comment. This is kind of more like what Bill was saying, more like an operating license. There wouldn't be any suggested proposal to change our permitting for repairs, construction, removal. You know, that's a separate process, correct? Outside of this is more like an agreement to ensure that the financials are there and that they're agreeing to meet these minimum requirements just to be able to own and operate a dam in the state of Michigan, right? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the initial license for a new dam and your, permit to construct probably are the same transaction,
Right.
though each have to have their own criteria. But after that, I view them as separate.
Yeah, point of just a simple question on clarification. So it's referring to navigable streams or tributaries too. So tributaries too could be non-navigable. So
Yes.
essentially any stream, is that the intent? Okay.
It's pretty close to where we are, yeah.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point. Go ahead.
I would suggest we just reference part 301 because it has a definition of stream, and then that'll overlap well with our definitions that we administer under our statutes, as opposed to kind of getting into more of a legal term or federal term. That would just be my suggestion. And I was curious, Luke, is this similar to any other states?
Amy, you just went silent for me.
Yep.
And your mic got really quiet.
Luke, are there other states that do this?
There are other states that require kind of like a recurring license structure. I don't have examples and I haven't reviewed them, I haven't time, but that was on my list of things to do from the last meeting, was to kind of reach out and get some examples. And I know Dan wanted to say something too, but I wanted to just put something for thought. Is there are a lot of dams that are off stream, water reservoirs, waste treatment, water treatment lagoons, tailings basins, things like that, that are not across the stream. So just a food for thought of whether those should or should not be included.
So do you think some of those are going to be higher significant hazard?
A lot of those are high and significant hazard.
Yep.
Well, let me ask the question another way. Would the 301 definition cover those?
Nope. So a lot of the dams that are off stream are not impacting a inland lake or stream. They're not regulated under 301. Unless they create a lake, which may, I don't know, I've talked to Amy about that one, but the thought, if you're going to talk, tie back to definitions and statute, maybe just the 315 definition of dam fits, because that does, they have to be 6 feet high and impound 5 acres of fluid, but that is kind of, it accounts for on stream and off stream dams, so. But yeah, so maybe not tying it to a stream, although I know that's the language in the Constitution, is on a navigable stream.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, that'll be an area for us to explore whether we have a good way to create a foundation for the financial responsibility part of this for those that are not on streams. And if it can be the same, through the counties that we propose here, or if it has to be something different.
Great, we'll note that, Douglas.
The other concept I was going to throw out there in regards to some of the license conditions in regards to that financial responsibility is the state of Pennsylvania. I talked to them this past week, and they actually require that the owners post a bond or letter of credit, and the value of that needs to be equivalent to or commensurate with the cost for breaching the dam, or basically removing the risk of the dam. So that might be a consideration. And there's some other programs tied to that. I sent some of that information to a couple of the task force members.
And I personally like that, because then you got other eyes on what's happening with the dam, because somebody else is potentially going to have to pay. And
Right.
I that makes enormous sense to me.
Okay. So if you're sort of making notes on these points, Mark, that would be another item under the financial responsibility section that's on page 3. Actually under number 3 so H, small number, Roman 2(3), then there'd be an item on the next page underneath that would include, oh, I'm sorry, I'm misleading. It'd be the number 4, under number 4, I'm sorry. Misreading my own document. So underneath there, just add another item for a bond for breaching. We can work on the words.
That's breaching, I think,
Yep.
Aaron?
Yeah.
Or removal, right?
Sorry, I'm muted. It was breaching or otherwise removing the hazard.
Okay, which would mean taking the dam out. Could mean that, right? That's good language.
And, it also addresses those issues for things like tailings dams, where breaching isn't necessarily the action you would take. It may be instead capping and site closure. Yep.
Okay. So if we can go back to page 2. Okay. License application completeness is just really a flag that we have to have some, timelines procedurally in the law. I don't think any of us are wedded to those numbers or that language. So license issuance, we're now starting to lay out, the real rules here. Clear title to the structure is one thing. And then there's a public interest test. And I'll just flag that when I drafted this and then in our conversations, we were thinking that the protection of the public trust falls within that. But I'm on reflection, and I haven't talked to Brian or Bill about this, but I'm thinking we may want to insert a provision like is in the Lake and Stream Act, something along the lines that, the construction and continued maintenance will not unlawfully impair or destroy any of the waters or other natural resources of the state or the public trust therein. So just sort of, that blanket, can't issue a permit that is unlawful or a license that's unlawful on fundamental law. So I'm thinking we will add that as another item here before and separate from the public interest item, but that's open for discussion. Just to finish out the rest of those rules, though, the third item here is just basically they have been maintaining it properly, or will. Then there's the initial demonstration of financial responsibility, which we'll get to in a moment. We need much better words on this next item, which is, proper coordination with emergency preparedness. But since we have another group talking about that, we wanted to leave it sort of open. And then finally, we want to formalize that they've got to get a resolution from the county. Now, this is all in the context of it being on the navigable streams. So I guess we have to rethink whether that's applies to these land-based dams that we were talking about earlier. So those are the basic rules for issuance. Any discussion before we go on? And then next is a list of conditions that can be put in the license, and we probably need a catch-all, other, but basically they have to stay, in order to keep the license, they have to stay in compliance with laws and regulations. They have to maintain and operate, and this will be a tie to your inspection process, I assume. They have to maintain financial responsibility by the criteria that we'll get to in a minute. They have to continue to work with emergency preparedness. They have to pay their fees. And then if a condition is violated, we'll have a reasonable cure. And if not, you're into a Rogers hearing and taking the license away. Okay. Luke?
Doug, this is Mario. Just for completeness, should
Yeah.
we add the word Constitution Article 7?
Oh,
People may
yes.
not know what Article
Yes.
7 is.
Yes, thank you. This is back up under E6, where it says Article 7, Section 12, just insert Constitution before the Michigan Constitution.
I had a comment on that same item, E6 anyway. This is a little bit of a chicken and egg issue that you run into, whether it's a sewer plant, like a package plant permit or a wetland permit. A local agency sometimes feels like they're in a bit of a bind once Eagle has issued a permit, yet they haven't made a decision or weighed things in. I'm not sure the best solution there, but I'm wondering if, number one, we wouldn't want to have the county specifically comment on public trust, because I think Doug's point last meeting was well taken, that the locals probably are best suited to be in the middle of that debate about, do we really need this or want this particular dam or not? I do think that's a worthwhile concept, but it's difficult to have a good discussion about that if Eagle's already weighed in. What pops into my head and might not be the right answer is maybe if, when the director determines public trust, that that the director is, seeking input from the local county. The county's got 60 days to provide the director with input before they make a decision or something like that. Just one thought on that particular item. I don't want to bog us down, but just a pin on that.
All right. So I just want to go ahead, Bill.
I was just going to say that that's precisely the way this is worded, that the director can't issue a license until the governing board of the county in which the structure is located has adopted a resolution pursuant to the Constitution. So the thought here is, county gets, you the director can't issue a license until that has happened.
I guess I got bogged down with the last phrase, after receipt of a report and recommendation from the director. So that's
all. I see where you're going. Yeah. I appreciate that. Then sounds like we're on the same page, and it's just maybe we just take that out, Douglas, after the receipt of a report and recommendation from the director.
So I understand Evan's point, but I'm wondering if the local government shouldn't be informed by the analysis that the Eagle staff will do.
Yeah.
Maybe it can be a report without a recommendation.
Mm-hmm. You know, or relevant information from the director or something like that. But I also feel like we're really looking to pin down that this governing board should be commenting on that public trust specifically.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to comment on, I think you ought to issue a license, you know, can go either way. I think their role is really on the public trust piece of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Again, from that local level, like you pointed out, but I'm good otherwise.
Yeah. And Douglas, if I may, just for the sake of time, we're on page 2, and I just want to be mindful, not getting too far. Well, we can flag these things. I don't think the goal is to necessarily resolve all of the language issues if we can quickly, but
Okay.
Again, just to keep things moving. Thank you.
All right, sure. So we talked about the conditions. The dams must be in the public interest section. There's some important nuance here. This is where we sort of parse out the level of scrutiny based on who owns the dam and whether FERC is involved. So the idea here is we'll have a presumption that's in the public interest if it's licensed by FERC, if it's owned by the United States or Michigan or a subdivision. So essentially we're only going to deal with private dams if it's a lake level control structure that's already been authorized, then, you know, we consider it to be in the public interest because there's that determination already. Then if it's an existing dam getting an initial license, we're sort of narrowing it down to, is this a bad actor in some way? Otherwise, they're going to get a license in this initial round. And I think that, if nothing else, reflects political reality that if we say suddenly we're going to tell a bunch of people to remove the dams immediately, you know, that's going to be hard. So then the renewals and any new dams would fall under what is Roman numeral 4 there. And that is a sort of operational public trust determination. Dam owner financial responsibility, the other core thing that we were trying to accomplish, is in the next section. And we're saying both initially and then on an ongoing basis in conjunction with each of the inspections, they've got to demonstrate financial responsibility. They need to be insured. And this, Bill commented about other eyes looking at it. I think that this is another case of that. The insurance company is going to be scrutinizing what's going on with the dam. And then we need deep enough pockets to deal with the dam. And so, again, if it's owned by the United States or the state of Michigan, I think they have deep enough pockets to deal with the dam if necessary. If it's owned by a subdivision of the state of Michigan, it depends on which subdivision. And so set it as an opportunity for the director to sort of scrutinize that. And then if it's owned by an electric utility regulated by the Public Service Commission, the commission is already looking at such things, and so we can just ask them to certify in each rate case that things are as they ought to be. Otherwise, we're moving into where we're going to assure sufficient financing for removal and maintenance through a property tax assessment, which then triggers all the tools of property taxation for enforcement. And the idea here would be either it's a property tax assessment on the dam owner, or it's an arrangement where other stakeholders are agreeing to an assessment district. I suppose we could rule out the possibility of a dam owner being something other than, you know, it's like a lake level control district or something, but sort of not trying to overreach here. Any questions on that?
You may have covered this before, but does FERC have the financial, any financial requirements?
They are variable on that. For example, there are some licenses that require escrow for dam removal and others that do not.
FERC certainly has the authority to request, to go through the financials at relicensure or licensure of a project. But I think, as Doug had indicated, that's variable on how that gets applied.
It certainly couldn't have happened up at Edenville, right?
Right.
It did not happen in Edenville.
Doug, this is Mario again. I just have one question regarding the time frame for the licensing for new dams. That should go concurrently with the permit for the construction of the dam or afterwards?
I'm thinking that, it'd be one application resulting in the issuance of both the permit to construct and the license.
Okay, thank you.
So then the next section just deals with license transfer and basically says both the director and the county need to agree to that transfer, mostly because we're depending on the county to enforce the financial responsibility. And then the enforcement of licensing is sketchy. I'm sure that needs a lot more work, but the core idea here is you have the right to order a drawdown. The director can undertake to remove the dam, and that has to be financed. And first recourse is to the owner, but then we need a dam safety fund or something for those cases where the money doesn't exist. So that's our construct.
Great, thank you, Douglas. Nice piece of work. Just sort of open it up. Others, members, as well as technical staff here. Initial reactions to this. Again, we're not looking to wordsmith it, but just generally, conceptually, this seems to hone in on the recommendation, the spirit of the recommendation from ASDSO. Obviously, takes it quite a bit further in its detail. On the right. Yeah. Go ahead, Tom. No.
This is expected to be legislation, is what it's being proposed as?
Yes, there's no way most of this could be done any other way.
It has to go through the legislature.
Yep.
Okay. Good. Why don't we, if there are any more observations or comments at this point on what you've heard from Douglas and others? Okay, let's flip back to the recommendations then, and now kind of maybe backing into those recommendations after we've seen and discussed what we have. I'm looking at the top left there, require license of a finite term for existing unpermitted. At expiration, terminate needs to be removed, retained states. There's a question there about. So, I mean, we're close with this recommendation, it would appear, other than just sort of a question mark at the end of that edited text there.
Yeah, this is just like the same notes from the last meeting. So yeah, like Mark's saying, feel free. It would be great if we can, I think the goal is to, okay, if we want to strike these, combine them, yeah, however we want to move forward, just make sure that since we do have these very detailed, this document that will eventually be an appendix to the final report. It'd be great to kind of finalize the recommendation language here.
We might have an asterisk or something, appending these so people can, refer right to that language.
Yeah. Let me just point out that the writing that we provided by creating a licensing scheme that applies to FERC dams provides a vehicle for telling the owner they have to provide information and that sort of thing. But we didn't write any of that stuff in there. All that we did was deal with that it needs to be licensed, the term matches FERC, and they still have to do the financial responsibility, and the director still has to agree that it, you know, meets the public interest test. But things like filing reports and so on, we need some help on that from Luke and Dan and anybody else.
Or we can look at it. I got a question for Amy, maybe. There's a lot of reference in here that the director shall make this decision. The director makes that decision on and issues the license. I think that statute kind of generally refers to the department.
Okay.
And then it gets delegated. So I just wanted to raise that as if it's a concern that it says director.
Yeah, I noticed that. I noticed that too, Luke, and I think you're right. It probably should say department, and then the department basically puts together delegation letters and decides which things get delegated down and which things stay with the director.
That's fine. You got to remember that Douglas and I go way back to the 70s when it always used to say the director.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly. Or the commission, depending on which.
Commission, right.
Yeah.
I thought it was the 60s, Bill. Oh, it's the 70s?
No, there's no criticism in that. I was just, you know, I applaud your effort, guys. This is very helpful. So.
Yeah, now, in terms of the wording here, though, aren't we requiring licenses for all dams, including existing and currently permitted and unpermitted dams, to operate and maintain these dams in a safe condition? So that ought to be clear. That language needs to be clear. Existing permitted and unpermitted dams.
Okay, excellent.
So, quick question, does permitted and unpermitted mean all the unregulated dams too, the ones that don't meet the size criteria for 315? So that takes it from like 1,100 to 2,600 plus? Okay, just wondering.
I'd like to do that, and I, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, we're going to have to figure that out, and maybe that's for the legislature to how big a staff are you going to need, and you know, but some of those dams that are out there, I mean, it'd be nice to know who's responsible for them, right? And assess whether or not they're going to cause damage.
Sure.
That seems to make most sense from what I'm hearing. Others agree with that notion?
So are we moving forward? Are we combining this one here, this requiring, you know, this language with this one up here? Or should they stay separate? Like, does there need to be more work on, you know what I'm saying? Does there need to be more work on like the actual recommendations to put them forward? Or, you know, are they fine the way they are, or to combine them?
I think we,
go ahead, Douglas.
I was just gonna say, I think we can leave them separate and then somehow note, you know, that they tie to the same sort of work product.
Okay, so is everyone fine with, I mean, I can get rid of this, like all this red is just, like I said, notes. So do you want me to just leave these, the language as it is in both and just say reference that, what will be that appendix?
Everybody okay with that? I am.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but in the third one, we're not just requiring owners of high and significant hazard dams to provide proof of financial responsibility. We're asking that all dams, right?
Right.
Okay.
The price tag will be very different.
But they gotta show something. They gotta say they're responsible, and then we got a way to deal with it.
Okay, great. I like that suggestion too on the mechanics of how these things are organized, keeping them separate, but having a nexus between the work product that we've just discussed. Okay, excellent. Anything else on these recommendations here? Looks like full agreement. Again, thanks, Douglas, Brian, and Bill for that. Again, excellent work.
Thank you.
I think what we wanted to leave time for today, I think we've kind of gone through the recommendations, and I see we have an adopt or pending. There were a couple there where we were looking for a little bit more information. Let's just revisit that one real quick where your cursor is. Aaron, require inspection of construction under review. Can you just I'm sorry, Luke, refresh my memory here on this recommendation?
Sure, I think this is to expand our current authority. Dogs are feedback, but anyway, to expand our current authority, in the rules, it requires that, you know, upon project completion, we do an inspection before we close out the permit. I think that this was to expand that to include a inspection of construction. Okay, construction inspection to require it prior to completion. You know, some type of inspection of the construction site with the engineer present. So it gets back to those frequent, you know, inspection. So I think it gets tied into those other ones where, you know, definitely before first filling, frequently during construction, and upon completion. You know, I think it's kind of the whole suite of like dam safety staff should be visiting these sites and meeting with the engineer and going over things to make sure that everything's going accordingly. So I think that's what this recommendation is, that part, meeting with the engineer on site during construction to make sure everything is going appropriately.
Okay, now the way it's written, let me ask it this way. Does it give you what you need to be able to get to that end point? Or do we need to refine that language any further, or we still need to review this further as the notes indicate?
So I think what we were talking about with those other topics were that I think we have the authority to do this anyway now through permit condition or whatever, but there is a very specific requirement in the rules now for post-construction inspection by the department prior to finalization, you know, close out of the permit. So, and that's for any repair, construction, removal, any permit that we issue under 315 that's not a minor project. So it's a requirement. So I guess that would be the discussion. The only further discussion I think we need is, do we also need to make this a requirement, or are we just okay with making it more of like a procedure that we follow under current authority? So my thought is, if we have the authority, you know, we can just do it. But I guess if this group feels differently, then, you know, by all means, make that suggestion.
I agree with that, Luke, except for things where there's a lot of pushback from the regulated community. It's really nice to have it in statute and rules. So I guess, is this something that we're going to get a lot of complaints about, or is this something that is sort of standard practice in the mind of most people?
I think for large projects, people are going to expect that we're probably going to come out during construction. You know, some of these projects, you know, that we issue, the construction might last all of a couple days. You know what I mean? So maybe we're not going to make it out on those anyway. But, you know, so I think we have the final, you know, codified. Maybe we just add a little blurb that says, you know, any point during construction and, you know, at final, you know, the department comes out and does these inspections, you know. So if you wanted to add that little blurb to the existing that said, you know, at any point during construction, you know, the department has the authority to come out and require that the engineer's on site or something like that, to do a progress check. But yeah, other than that, I think we have the authority. I don't foresee a lot of pushback, you know, unless somebody's doing something that's not above water. So.
Okay.
So with that minor tweak, then it sounds like we may have covered it. Is that what I hear? Comments from other subgroup members?
Agreed.
I agree. I think if the department thinks they got the discretion to do that, then let leave them with the discretion.
Okay. All right, good. Then just looking down at the others here, Aaron, to provide. Okay. Is there anything you see on this spreadsheet that you've wanted to talk about, feel hasn't been talked about? Any questions, clarifications? You feeling good about the columns here and what you're seeing?
One last question mark here on this one. This was the only one that doesn't have adopt under it. I know we were talking about this about yeah, this was one, Luke, that we were talking about, just looking at other states or whatever. But besides that, I guess, does everyone feel like we can move forward with this worded the way it is? The substantial increases in program costs.
So, I mentioned this earlier in our proposal in terms of licensing, we sort of carve out FERC, but we really didn't speak to these issues. We're going to have the state license it despite the fact that FERC does. We're going to apply the financial responsibilities criteria to it despite the fact that it's licensed by FERC. But we didn't speak to inspection, sharing of information, or any of those kinds of things. I think we do need to say something about those because we're going to want to either say, no, we're not doing any of that stuff. If it's FERC regulated, we're leaving it to FERC, or more likely we're going to want to say, well, even though it's regulated by FERC, they at least have to file reports with the department or something. But I'm looking for advice from Luke and Dan and Amy on that.
And so I didn't have time to dig into this one very deeply since the last meeting, but I think you're right, Douglas. I mean, lots of states do it different ways. Some states do full co-regulation where they have to meet the FERC requirements and the state requirements. Most states, I would think, do what we do, which is we do not co-regulate. But what I'm most interested in is kind of this subset of states that are in the middle where they don't have regulatory authority, but there are requirements that FERC licensees submit documentation to the state dam safety program. So the stuff that typically gets stamped critical energy infrastructure information and goes directly to FERC and then nobody else sees it, that stuff is required by the owner who aren't subject to the CEII requirements because it's documents that they produce. They can give them to whoever they want, have to provide those to the state, presumably under some agreement that the state will not share those with FOIA, as FOIA, wouldn't share those through FOIA requests and give them to people who aren't authorized to see them. But I think that's what personally, that'd be my interest, would be not to co-regulate, but to have some type of requirement that dam owners do provide the dam safety program with requisite information to understand the safety of the dam. But yeah, I'll get some examples of what other states are doing, and maybe we can, but I don't really know what the first part of this means, consider the substantial increases in program cost. And then it kind of takes a left turn and starts talking about FERC co-regulation. So I don't, maybe I need to go back to ASDSO and get clarification on the first part, but maybe that's the suggestion, is just kind of table the first sentence and then think about the second one with that additional information of what the other states are doing.
I would be comfortable, Luke, with you, rewriting this in a way that fits the program that you're talking about, and let us look at it. But if you could redraft it, that would be helpful, I think.
Sure.
You're the guy that's got to implement it. So.
Yep. So I will reach out to ASDSO and see if I can get some examples of other states, and then I'll email this group with what I think this recommendation actually gets at, and what maybe our first cut at what it should say would be, something like that. So okay.
That's great, Luke, and we'll handle that via email and any feedback, and we'll make changes as necessary and appropriate so that we can include that in the report out language, on November 30th. So that'd be great. And so that would mean if we can get this turned around, you know, by close of business Wednesday next week, I think is probably, or Tuesday. Aaron's saying Tuesday. let's shoot for Tuesday, but we'll settle with Wednesday. All right. Thanks, Luke. Okay, great. Aaron, thanks for bringing that to my attention. One final call on any other recommendations, any sort of lingering issues, thoughts in your head swirling around, anything we've missed?
I have one lingering.
Okay.
One lingering issue. And somebody else, and that is, I'm still concerned that we don't distinguish between high hazard and significant hazard for natural resources problems. I mean, there's got to be a kind of a stream, something that is different than in a high hazard category that should be different than a significant hazard. We do it for human dwellings, but we don't do it for natural resource damages. And is there a way we can do that?
Yeah, I know we touched on this a little bit at one of the subgroup meetings or the last one, Bill, and what I heard is that it seems like Michigan's language is relatively consistent with what, FERC or sort of the national program language, or from other states at least, and they have the authority, or it's in statute that natural resources are sort of part of that. It's what I recall, though. I don't know, Luke, if you can kind of clarify and respond to Bill's question about how we can maybe address it more forcefully or specifically.
Yeah, I was trying to quickly read the definition, see if there was any distinction. I think you're right. I think it just uses the same exact language. But yeah, I think that, you know, they both use the word significant and maybe we would change one to severe, but there's still some subjectivity in that, right? Of where do we draw that line? So,
well, let me ask a different question, approach it from a different way. Would it be possible for you to get a list, go to the DNR and ask them to give you their definition of where there are, what streams are more likely to pose a high hazard natural resource damage than a stream that is a significant hazard potential? I mean, it strikes me that they've got a stream classification system over there, and that might be one way to approach it. Douglas, you've been involved in that. Does that work? Could that work?
I think that's part of it, but it also depends on the nature of the dam.
Sure.
So what do we want to do? I mean, to make sure that this isn't sort of lost in the conversation.
I can dig in a little bit further to it and pull kind of ASDSO to see if there are states that do make this differentiation. If the hazard potential is solely based on environmental degradation, where do you draw the line between significant and high? Because obviously, like Doug said, and what I think we're alluding to is that there's other things, you know, loss of life, you know, if it goes from potential to probable, that's high regardless, right, of environmental. But if you're basing your delineation solely on environmental degradation, which I think we do, you know, where flooding and public safety aren't the concerns, it's environmental degradation only on a handful of dams. So yeah, there's a lot of subjectivity, and I just confirmed that they use the exact same language. So in current statute, there is no delineation.
Yeah, so here's an example that I think is concrete of something we'd probably want to consider, and that's the how much sediment is accumulated behind the dam that would come downstream if there was a breach.
Right.
Yep, from a quantity and quality standpoint.
Right.
Just so I know, what is this? Is that Bill in reference to one of these specific recommendations or just
No.
like generally?
No, but it came up in the context of where we've got the definitions of high hazard and significant hazard.
So maybe this is sort of a good segue into the next segment, which is new recommendations. Is that reasonable?
It is. Let me flag one thing that we don't need to talk about much, but if we go with this sort of licensing financial responsibility scheme we talked about, it seems to me there are some new tasks for the dam safety unit that haven't been itemized and included in the estimates. And we probably should account for those.
I was thinking that too, Doug, but I didn't want to put Luke or Dan on the spot and say, how many people is this going to take? So we'll work on that because I think that's a big lift.
Yeah, Amy, and I know in sort of the context of our discussions this week about costs overall and how they're kind of cross-cutting across the subgroups work. And so I don't know if there's an opportunity in that you were going to do kind of look at some of these things, maybe include it there.
Sure, we can do that.
Am I tracking that right? I mean, the conversation to kind of.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to try to put the financial responsibility insurance recommendations that kind of flow through the different subgroups and try to put them all in one list so everybody can see them holistically, because there's recommendations relating to the emergency fund, and then there's also the financial assurances, and there's several different themes going on. I thought it would be helpful if they were all on one document or in a table so everyone could see them.
Great, thank you.
Mark, I just wanted to flag one other one here too that maybe you can follow up on and figure out the right way to handle is, you know, this committee is about legislative or authority notions. And I know that we have a separate one on enforcement and compliance. And not knowing where that committee has been going with it, you know, my one flag is, personally, I think some of the necessary things that we need to recommend to improve our tool set for enforcement and compliance is crafting authority that is not there, and defining it a little bit more. So I'm not sure if like the other committee is already doing that, or if they're thinking more of it as a within the program, you know, kind of rules or standard procedures for use of existing discretion. But, you know, I don't know if they're coming up with stuff that needs kind of legislative or new authorities to accomplish what that group's contemplating. I don't know if that makes sense, but there's a little bit of an overlay.
Because these subgroups are somewhat siloed, there may be needs in the other groups for legislation or authority type things to happen. Is that
right?
Okay.
That is definitely true, Brian. I think the way that ASDSO organized these, they put a lot of the big picture things in the legislative and authority recommendations, but there are definitely other things, and each one of the tables for the subgroups, we've tried to say where we thought a legislative or rule change would be required. So when we put all of those together, you'll be able to see that. And now that the recommendations have slightly changed in some cases, we're going to have to look at that again to see if we need to adjust any of those.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't want to jump across to different committees, but you know, I just foresaw some enforcement things that may come down to, you know, legislative or authority issues that we're not picking up, and you know, hopefully the other committee is. But
yeah, and I think I don't want to overstep on that, but yeah, I think also like at the next, you know, full task force meeting and possibly the one in December as well, right? Like that's kind of the, hopefully that'll be, you know, some discussion if it needs to happen, you know, with everyone there to kind of, and you can talk about this later, Mark, but just, you know, this every group like reporting out kind of, you know, high level overview of like what we've accomplished, you know, so that everyone can kind of hear, and then hopefully we can, you know, identify any gaps or further needs from there. So.
Great. All right, thanks. So back to the recommendations then. Bill, did I kind of hear that maybe there is a formation of a recommendation and definitions of high versus significant? Is that?
Yeah.
Is there we have enough there to kind of recommend, or just that refine the current
For natural resource damage.
to be more explicit or focus on natural resource damage?
Yeah, I think what he's saying, it needs to provide some delineation.
Right.
Now, there's no delineation between significant and high when it's only considering natural resource impacts.
Okay.
And this is Dan Devine. I guess one thing that I'll again throw out maybe as a question for the group is, you know, what they're considering or what their thoughts are on trying to maintain consistency with the federal guidelines for hazard classification. And you know, to be honest, looking at FEMA's document right now for hazard classification, they don't actually include environmental impacts or economic impacts in high hazard potential. It strictly is loss of human life.
Mm-hmm.
So just to be clear then, I mean, this recommendation going forward would be placed in statute then, right? As part of a legislative package to make that clarification.
Right. I mean, it might be something as simple as if it's on a, Douglas, remind me, what's the highest level of trout stream? Or Brian, what is it? There's a word for it.
Are you thinking of the blue ribbon trout stream?
Yeah. Blue ribbon. Yeah. I mean, I would be, you know, I mean, that might be a way to look at it. That's what I'm most concerned about is a bad dam on a very high quality recreational stream.
Well, maybe that's part of the delineation, because a lot of work has gone into inventorying those blue ribbon trout streams, right? And so if that's what we're trying to protect, I mean, not only those, however.
Right.
It would be pretty, I think that you could use a couple of metrics to define, you know, sort of the level of environmental impact or natural resource impact. You guys have mentioned, I mean, which type of streams they're on is a good usable piece of that. The size of the dam, the number of miles that are disconnected, the sediment sources, temperature impact. There's a few different types of metrics that I would expect that you could kind of put together and actually could model probably pretty easy for just about any dam if you were to do it. I think the key is just kind of spelling out for here that you know, we recommend the definition of environmental hazard be refined and developed for use in these hazard ratings. But there's some easy tools, yeah.
Okay, so rather than natural resources, you're saying a redefinition of environmental impacts to include more specifically natural resources. That's what I sort of heard, Brian.
Well, I don't know. I don't want to say. I mean, I think of them all together. I think. Right, am I wrong in saying that currently it mentions environmental impact in the state hazard definitions? Is that right, Luke? Yeah, so it's just it's a very general term, and so I personally wouldn't necessarily be saying that, you know, you need to carve out, you know, fisheries or natural resources as separate from environmental. But I think the key was just, can we, you know, add some actual clarity or some quantitativeness or just some separation between those, that next time we get around to redoing an assessment of that, there's something usable. I mean, my hunch is, I could be horribly wrong, and I don't want to seem disrespectful, but if it's just left as, you know, undefined environmental risk, we probably don't really consider it as much when we're looking at the hazard ratings when it's undefined completely.
They use
Go ahead, Luke.
They use the term environmental degradation in state definition.
Well, why don't we add significant natural resource damage to high hazard? In other words, it would read environmental degradation and significant natural resource damage to high hazard.
Okay.
And then just leave the middle one as environmental degradation.
Yep.
See what I'm saying? That might solve it.
Yep.
Sorry,
Currently,
yeah, just one more time.
so currently, I think the delineation is only by risk for loss of life, and I think that's
Right.
echoed for what's in federal definitions as well. So, you know, if you wanted to say, you know, if everything else is the same and this one has natural resources impact or loss of life, then it's high. You know, that would seem to make sense. And I think we've actually taken that approach, you know, on some dams where it's solely high because contaminated sediments,
Right.
environmental impacts expected from contaminated sediment, but
Right.
that has that human, you know, health risk associated with it and aquatic life hit risk. So I wouldn't have any heartburn about saying all these are significant, but if it has environment or
Significant significant natural resource damage. Brian, does that, and Douglas, does that, I mean, that way, if you got, to me, if you're on a blue ribbon trout stream or a significant, you know, recreational place, that's something that the department ought to be looking at.
Mhm.
Okay, so we're adding significant natural resource damage to the high hazard
The
definition.
high hazard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You know, that'll have to be operationalized, but I think that's
Right.
sufficient for now.
Yeah, that gives you the delineation between the two, because currently there is none, it sounds like, which is what we're striving for.
Yeah. I would agree of, you know, the need for further defining, and at the risk of adding a little complexity to it. And perhaps this is why at the federal level it was left at, you know, impacts to human life, or is that you know, there may be situations where, I mean, this assumes the failure of one of these structures, right, in a given place. So the relative risk of this high hazard is defined by its failure. So in some cases, one might argue that the failure, or rather the absence of that structure, is actually beneficial to the system. You know, that there's more environmental hazard or environmental damage or degradation occurring because of its very existence in the system.
Right.
So we might want to think about how that plays into this in a situation of failure, whether it's rebuilt or not, or how that's considered. Because yeah, I would agree there's going to be an impact of a failure, but in the long term, it's actually it may be beneficial to the system.
But you got to get them to take it out, and that's what I'm thinking.
Right,
that's what I'm trying to head toward. I don't want another situation like Lotus. You know.
Yes.
So real quick on that point, what is it? 315, I forget what it is, but we have a section on enforcement that gets to the point that Brett just made, said the existence of a dam or the operation of a dam causes this environmental impact. Then we can actually order them to draw down, cease operation, remove. We have that authority under, I'm trying to find it on the fly here, but it might be 315.19, order to limit dam operations or order to remove a dam. So we have that authority, but it doesn't play into the initial determination of the hazard potential.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Excellent. Thanks, Bill, for bringing that to our attention. Other new recommendations, concepts, again, sort of you've been thinking about, mulling over, have questions about, wanted to, you know, trial balloon, float before your subgroup members here for discussion, anything like that?
Well, one issue that we didn't deal with in our little subgroup that needs to be dealt with, you know, if we go to this licensing structure and every dam is licensed, and everybody's got to get, you know, there are going to be dams that don't meet the requirements. And how do we get, and they're going to be dams that you can't find the owner. There are going to be dams where they should come out, but who's going to pay for it? So we didn't deal with that. And in other words, where do you get the money? Where's the money going to come from for a significant dam removals? If you can't identify the owner, or the owner does not have any resources to be able to do that.
I think we touched on this in the other budget funding subgroup a little bit, Bill. It's part of that larger discussion on costs.
I don't think we came up with a recommendation for it, though.
I don't think we did either.
We were talking about it in the compliance and enforcement, and they ran out of time in their subgroup to really address it. But in the survey responses to the task force, we had some responses that dam removal as a compliance tool should be discussed, and so they didn't end up making a recommendation on it either. So this might be a good place and time to talk about it.
Okay, let's do that.
I forget what Luke told me whenever that was, 2 days ago. There's like $1.2 million a year in the habitat management fund that DNR gives grants for, and that's for everything. That's not just dam removal. That's all sorts of habitat improvement projects. Is that right, Luke? Is that what you said?
Dam management can go to removal. That's 350,000, and then former habitat management grant, I think is 1.2 million. So there's 1.5 million or so that can go to dam removal, but it's competitively, it's a competitive grant program for all suite of projects that address those two issues. So
the dam removals that we've seen come through over the last couple of years, what do you think the price tags on those were? Maybe not the Boardman, maybe some of the others.
Well, the Boardman wasn't that expensive. I mean.
Oh, really? Okay.
I mean, some of those were 3.5 million, some of those were 12 or something like that. But I think I've seen them go for 100,000. If it's a small dam that maybe has been drawn down already and there's not a whole lot of sediment to deal with. But I've seen them go for 20, 30, 40, to high tens of millions of dollars too. So I think a good kind of ballpark that we say is typically between 1 and 3 million is your typical dam removal. And then, obviously, if you've got contaminated sediment or anything like that, that probably price tag can quadruple, 10 times, easily. But that's the typical, I would say.
But so the recommendation focuses on those abandoned dams that are at some risk of failure or need to be dealt with.
Not necessarily abandoned. It also can be that the owner doesn't have the wherewithal.
It doesn't have the money. Yeah.
Just walk away. Or just says, I can't do it.
Yeah.
Okay, so go ahead.
I was just say kind of the way we've worked through this is, try to help them find the funding through grants. But if they're, they're not playing ball or whatever, we have the authority to make that emergency order and then step in and take any necessary action. But like I said, that all ties back into, does the state have the resources and everything to be able to do something like that as a more frequent, enforcement, compliance tool. So I think, we probably have the authority under state statute, but obviously more funding and more resources obviously helps get the job done.
And I think really the big difference here is that, we're basically putting a mandate out that step up to the plate or they get out, either get out of the way or get their dam out of the way. This is more or less kind of putting a 5-year time frame that, of having to have all these issues resolved more or less for these dams, in order to get licensure. So that's a really short timetable to address a lot of dams that likely will have to come out.
Right.
So go ahead, Brian.
I'll make the quick on this point is that, one of the problems that was that's been raised is certainly through some of the legislative hearings after Midland is people seem to be shocked that the vast majority of the money that does exist is all about fish. That seem to raise some anger or disbelief, but it does play into the fact that most of the money does come from fish conservation, whether it's state or whether it's the federal programs. And so that's going to leave a little bit of a soft problem as more of these do need to be removed. If they don't put up a lot of fisheries benefit, if they don't score well for miles reconnected, temperature impact, fisheries community present, it's going to leave a lot of people who need to remove a dam without a competitive avenue to the limited existing pots of money.
Okay, thank you, Brian. I'm trying to get us to where the pen hits the paper here, just to make sure we record this recommendation. So, go ahead,
well,
Douglas.
maybe this helps, maybe not, but it seems to be another part of the problem with the grants that we're talking about is that they're essentially in operating budgets. And so they're modest size, they're relevant, but you can't say, well, we're going to take out a $12 million project. So it seems to me that the right answer is going to have, first of all, it's going to have to be public money for the category of dams we're talking about.
Right.
Secondly, it's going to have to come in big lumps for some of these dams. And so it seems to me that it's either a capital outlay, which only happens if you can plan it, several years in advance, or there has to be essentially a borrowing structure where Eagle can say, this dam has to come out, we're going to spend the money, and then there's some way that it gets repaid over time, or financed over time. And one possibility for that too is the state has other pots of money that are designated for essentially emergencies. And in the case where we get to an actual emergency, the dam needs to be breached or come out, maybe it's not just a fund for dams, maybe it's a broader emergency fund.
Infrastructure more broadly. Let's, Aaron, take down some language here. I mean, just to get things started here. So what we're talking about is establishing a fund to address call it abandoned or those dams where owners are not positioned to remove them, however we want to say it.
Mm-hmm.
Removal.
Owner can't meet financial responsibility.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just saying removal of potentially unlicensed dams.
Was that a question, Dan? I'm sorry.
Suggestion maybe is for removal of unlicensed dams.
Okay. Because everything's going to be licensed and they're going to have the financial responsibility, right?
Right. That works.
We used the word fund here, but I remember last meeting we were talking more mechanism with Bill saying, hey, the counties could do that. I sort of heard Luke saying we kind of have the mechanism. I'm just wanting to pin down whether the to be dealt with later is just establishing the fund or also the mechanism.
Okay, can we call it a funding mechanism?
Well, I mean the mechanics of what's the process that you would go through. You don't necessarily have to get state funds, right? If you want to do a special assessment district, right? Do we need to cover that, or do we feel like that's covered well enough?
I think that's a good point, and that's probably something under the licensure verbiage, that needs to be, if it's not already included in there, should be addressed as far as if somebody doesn't get their license in this initial wave, or at some point in the future suspends their license.
Okay, so maybe we'll note that, Aaron, just so we make sure we capture it in the notes here. Is that sort of in the ballpark? It looks like what we have written there.
It's enough to remind us we've got a little more work to do.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Fair enough. And I see we are closing in, about 7 minutes or so left. Before we talk about next steps, to see if there's a volunteer to do a report out at the next task force meeting. Any other recommendations, thoughts?
Yeah. I got a couple of three, Mark, and we probably have time for detailed discussion, but maybe there's a way to get feedback. One, I feel like with Part 307, it would be nice to have the ability to have an emergency declaration that would allow you to supersede a court set lake level. You know, hey, we know that there's bad weather coming to an incredible extent and we want to draw this down. There's an obstacle there. So that would be one thing. Just again, emergency order for Part 307. I feel like there's a land use issue somewhere in all of this that we might consider some legislation as well. Might not be popular, but 3 particular sub areas. One area is if there is a proposed development or redevelopment in any community, that whatever the approving agency is gets a letter from the dam owner. The dam owner is asked to formally comment with a time frame, for example. A second area would be to ask that the downstream developers somehow acknowledge or certify that they've reviewed the EAP and they understand the risks of, again, developing in the inundation zone is what I'm talking about with both of those thoughts.
Okay, just pause for just a minute. I want to make sure Erin's got what she needs to capture this, Evan. No, this is good stuff.
I'm listening real hard and I'm
that first one, Erin, I think was for Part 307, if I heard correctly.
What, this one that was already, or
correct.
Yeah, the ability under 307.
Drawdown is 307. I can send over the text to this too, if that's.
Yeah, well, go ahead. Let's do that. Evan, why don't you go ahead though and just sort of give the highlights for the group members, and we'll send that out, and maybe as part of the follow-up with Luke, and we'll try and minimize the number of emails going out.
Yep, yeah, and certainly understood that these ideas may get crossed off the list. I just want to get feedback. And then a third bullet in the land use is, I feel like all real estate transactions, you know, you got that stack of 70 papers and you got to sign 40 things. I feel like one of those things, whether somebody looks at it or not, is all real estate transactions within an inundation zone should have a map in that stack of paper and a place for the purchaser to sign that they've reviewed the map. And the map would kind of show where the parcel is in that inundation zone. So I feel like all 3 of those are probably beneficial to a lot of people.
Yeah. Hey, Evan, just a quick question. Wouldn't we accomplish both of the things that you're talking about on the inundation zone if we simply said that the inundation zone has got to be included in the floodplain, or, you know, the flood hazard maps?
I don't know that I would totally agree with that off the top of my head, but it's certainly something that we could talk about. Making sure that the risk is acknowledged in a real estate transaction would be the goal, kind of with bullet, but also be making sure that a dam owner has weighed in on downstream development, and that a developer really understands what they're getting into. I believe creates a liability paper trail for if and when there is legal action after a problem. So I can't answer your question, Doug, but just food for thought.
And I guess Luke or Amy, you can maybe speak to this too, but I don't know if we can require flood and dam breach inundation zones to be required on floodplain maps if that's a federally regulated program.
Yeah, I don't think we can require it.
Yeah, this is Mario. Then you're absolutely correct, because there's going to be overlap there between the areas, and the flood insurance maps are for that purpose, for flood insurance.
Yeah, and just a little known fact, a flood insurance map, there's not much time and energy spent on ends up in your real estate transaction, and it's frequently not accurate if you're near the edge. Nobody ground truths that stuff at all. So just FYI.
Okay.
One final comment. Bill, it looks like you wanted to make a comment.
No, well, the only other, and tell me if I'm right or wrong on this. I'm triggered by what Evan said about real estate transactions. Are there places in Michigan or people that own property and therefore own a dam that they could or would sell to a subsequent owner, therefore accepting responsibility for it. Private parcels.
That happens all the time.
Well, then that should be disclosed.
I think it has to be, but I don't know if we don't have anything that.
No. You wouldn't amend. You wouldn't put this in your law. It would be in the real estate disclosure law.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm talking about, disclosure.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about the dam statute here. I'm talking about other statutes, but it's still a statutory legislative issue.
I think it happens a lot of times where people understand that they're getting the dam, but they don't understand all their roles and responsibilities of owning a dam once they buy it. So
that should be a requirement, it seems to me.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Douglas, you look like you maybe had one more comment, and then I think we need to wrap up here today.
It was covered.
Okay, great. Evan, we'll look forward, if you wouldn't mind just sort of jotting that down. I'll circulate it to the others for comment. Very productive meeting. The last item we had is sort of next steps, which are one, we'll wait and hear back from Luke, and then we'll be sending out Evan's recommendations that he just highlighted for any further review and feedback from subgroup members. And between now and November 30th, and as that information becomes available, we want to prepare for a report out to the full task force on November 30th. So is there somebody on the group here that would be willing to lead that on behalf of the subgroup? Don't make me pick someone.
It'd be a 5 minute thing max. So.
Yeah. Douglas, I hate to put you on the spot, but you did such stellar work on that document and seem to know it so well.
All
right.
Agree.
Okay. Well done.
Here, here.
Support.
You're supposed to say, if nominated, I will not accept. If appointed, I will not serve.
I'm mostly thinking about how I can do it in 5 minutes or less.
Okay, well, fair. That's fair. We'll help you along with that. How's that?
Okay.
Thank you for that. And thanks for all of your contributions here. Very good discussion. And again, that document you put together really made our job easier today, being able to respond to something. So I thank you for making my job easier and the process overall much more efficient. Evan, I'm sorry we got a little short on time there for yours, but we'll make sure it's covered. I think we got a good recommendation on the definition side with high hazard, and so some good stuff that we've captured for the broader task force. So Aaron, just make sure, did I miss anything else on the agenda? We're looking good. So that concludes the subgroup's work, I think, formally. We'll see what the report out looks like. But again, thank you all for your time. Have a great Thanksgiving, wherever you may be, and be safe. So thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Great weekend.
Take care.